Hi guys! Today I'm going to cover what is action queuing, also known as skill queuing. This goes hand in hand with GCD clipping and weaving, so they're all going to be covered. Do note that all of this is equally valid for all players, regardless of whether they play on controller, keyboard, MMO mouse side buttons, mouse clicking, or telepathy. You can also find a list of topics with timestamps in the description, as well as the written script, if at any point it is difficult to understand me because of my overall inability to speak properly. So, let's get started. GCD stands for Global Cooldown. The global cooldown means that when an action is used, other actions that are considered part of the global cooldown will also receive a recast timer. All weapon skills and spells are on the global cooldown. How long the global cooldown lasts will depend on the appropriate speed for the action type. Weapon skills activate the GCD using skill speed, while spells activate it using spell speed. The base GCD, without speed applied, is 2.5 seconds. Taking my paladin for example, my weapon skill GCD is 2.39 seconds, while my spell GCD is 2.5. If I use a weapon skill, all of the GCDs, including spells, receive a 2.39 second recast timer. If I use a spell, such as Clemency, all of my GCDs, including weapon skills, receive a 2.5 second recast timer. It is possible for a weapon skill to have an individual recast timer that is longer than the GCD. For example, on Machinist, Drill is a weapon skill, and my recast timer is 18.94 seconds. Using it will still activate the GCD, so while Drill will be on cooldown for nearly 20 seconds, the other weapon skills will be on cooldown for 2.36 seconds, which is my GCD on Machinist. It is also possible for an ability to be on the GCD, though it is much rarer. In the case that an ability is on the GCD, it will actually say so in the description, like Dancer's Standard and Tactical Steps and Machinist Flamethrower. Actions that are not on the GCD are called OGCD, which means it is off the global cooldown. Weaving is using an ability that is off the global cooldown while your global cooldown is still active. This can also be done with casting if the cast is shorter than the global cooldown. A double weave is when you use two OGCDs during your GCD, and is typically done when your GCD is instant, so it doesn't have cast. Every action has an animation log. Clipping is when an animation log from a previous action is preventing you from using an action that would otherwise be available to you. Typically, this refers to clipping your GCD actions, but technically speaking, you can also clip other actions as well. Most abilities have an animation log of around 0.5 to 0.7 seconds, but a few of them do have longer ones or shorter ones, and the only way you'll know is to play the job. Please note this is a different term from dot clipping, which refers to refreshing your dots or HOTS too early, and that would belong to another guide. You may be wondering whether spells that have shorter cast times than their cooldown may cause clipping on their next GCD if you weave an ability. Well, the first part to notice is how long is the difference? White Mage is a great example, so let's look at that. My Medikit has the same cast time as its recast. That means it is not a shortened cast at all, and you will absolutely be clipping your next GCD no matter what if you attempt to weave, because it won't actually be a weave. Cure 2 has a base reduction of 0.5 seconds. Cure has a base reduction of 1 second, and Isuna has a base reduction of 1.5 seconds. The reason I say base reduction is because both the GCD and your cast time are affected differently from your spell speed, and therefore you may see smaller reduction times because your GCD will be sped up more than the cast. As mentioned before, the majority of abilities have an animation log of around 0.5 to 0.7 seconds. Because of this, while you can use a spell that has a reduction of 0.5 to weave, you will end up clipping a little tiny bit. With a reduction of 1 second, you can safely single weave. However, if you attempt to double weave, you will clip yourself tremendously. With a reduction of 1.5 seconds, single weaving is super safe, and double weaving will clip a little, though not a lot. In general, you prefer to not clip at all. That being said, sometimes, depending on what's happening, a little bit of clipping might be acceptable. As such, it is not recommended to do any double weaves on shorter casts, and single weaves are preferred for when the reduction is long enough. Do learn which spells have good shortened cast times, and keep in mind that if you go for a crazy high speed build with your gear, you might need to adjust accordingly. So, before we get into action queuing, let's first see what they look like normally. If I have nothing happening and I use something, it activates immediately. This is true for casts or instants. I press, and it starts with no visible delay. Action queuing is when you use an action during the previous action's animation or GCD lock, depending on what you're pressing, and the game stores it and uses it as soon as it's able. To queue another GCD action while the GCD is active, you will need to use it roughly in the last 0.5 seconds of the recast, or roughly the last quadrant of the timer in the icon. If you attempt to queue it too soon, it will simply not do it. This holds true regardless of whether a GCD action is instant, a cast, or a shortened cast. For shortened casts, you'll need to queue the next GCD in the last roughly 0.5 seconds of the cooldown timer, not the cast itself. If you try to queue it during the cast, chances are it will be too soon. For those actions where the reduction baseline is 0.5 seconds, that means you can queue it as soon as it stops casting. For those that have longer reductions, you will have to get a feel for when the end of a GCD will be, or just spam it. You can, however, queue an OGCD as soon as you use a GCD. Furthermore, the two types of queuing can work together. You can use a GCD, immediately queue an ability, and queue the next GCD when the timer is low enough. Let me show you. I'm going to use Cure, Lucid, and another Cure. Do note that the OGCD animation lock must still resolve. While your GCD action will still queue, it will wait for the ability's animation lock to finish before it activates your skill. This is very visible if I use Cure 2, an ability, and then try to use Cure 2 again. You can also queue an ability into another ability if it has started its animation lock. When done on its own, this seems no harder than the previous version shown queuing an ability after a GCD. However, when done as part of a double weave, which means you are using a GCD and then queuing two abilities, if you go too quickly, this can actually fail. After all, if you immediately queue the first ability, which yes, it will queue, as discussed before, this means you need to wait for the GCD action's animation lock to finish so the first ability can start its animation lock, and then you can queue that second OGCD. While this is relatively fast, some people are just even faster at pressing buttons and keys, and if you're one of those people, you might end up pressing so quickly that the animation hasn't started yet. Like this. This is why people who forget, or weren't aware of, how queuing works, which requires having the previous lock, sometimes find that their double weave doesn't go off, something which can be deadly if it was knockback prevention. There are two ways to handle this. One, if you find yourself using those two OGCDs together very often, maybe separate them so you take a little bit longer. This can be as simple as putting them on a separate hotbar or different sections of the hotbar, and thus the hand movement is a natural buffer to slow you down. Just make sure it's not so extreme that you end up clipping your GCD when you otherwise wouldn't have, because you're no longer queuing, you're actually being late. The second solution is double hitting the second ability. It's rather unlikely that the first ability's animation lock won't have started by the time you press again. If you are finding that it still happens a lot, you must be very fast and might need more presses, or just learn to slow down a little. To be precise, action queuing works for skills in the actions and rules sections only. For skills found elsewhere, they do not support queuing. However, whether this is noticeable will depend on whether the action is affected by your character's animation lock. So, the following do not support action queuing, but you still need to use them when your previous animation lock is done. This often means spamming the button to happen as soon as possible. And those include items, duty actions, chocobo companion orders, limit break, and action macros, even if they're doing something that normally would. So that means even if the first line in your macro would use an action that would normally support queuing, the fact that it's now a macro means it no longer does. And that's one of the reasons why action macros, compared to other types of macros, are frowned upon. What some people may not be aware of is that sprint itself does not support queuing. This is one of the reasons why a sprint action macro is actually not bad. Neither using it normally nor via macro uses action queuing, so they're equal in efficiency. Well, technically speaking, they're not equal. However, that's because macros are in a system queue that's affected by frames per second. So on really weak machines, there is a small efficiency loss, but if your hardware is consistently dropping below 30 frames per second in more difficult content, you've got bigger things to worry about than sprint macro efficiency. By contrast, the following categories do not require for your character to be free of any action locks, and therefore you could use them even while casting. So while they can't technically be queued, that's simply because your character's system of locks isn't directly using these. And that includes your pet orders, so heal, stay, place, guard, steady, sick. It does not include the ones that are actually in your action list. Also, squadron command orders, can use them anytime. And non-action macros. As was covered before, macros cannot be queued, though they do use their own little system queue that's affected by overall game performance. Since the action command is the only one that would be tied to your character's own action logs, any macro you use that doesn't feature the action command can be used independently, even while you are casting. This is why targeting macros are perfectly fine, provided that the time you spent pressing the key doesn't delay your next key press too much. That's it for this particular video, though there will probably be a part 2 in the future for other topics like slide casting. Don't forget to hit that like button if you found this to be informative, and be sure to put any questions or concerns you may have in the comments section. And I will see you for the next one. Bye bye!